Hi, my name is Dr. Asia Eaton. I'm a psychological scientist and public psychologist, and this is Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. In this podcast, we invite human rights defenders to teach and learn from brain and behavioral scientists about how we can all use science to do human rights work that is more efficient and impactful.
Hello, everyone. Happy Friday, October 24th, 2025. This is Asia, and it is my privilege to be hosting Mindbridge Podcast, where science meets human rights. Today, we have Charissa and Marpheen on to talk about Asian American and Pacific Islander justice. Dr. Charissa Cheah, also goes by Su Ling, is a professor in the Department of Psychology and Asian Studies, a faculty affiliate at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. As a cultural developmental psychologist, Dr. Cheah utilizes mixed methods approaches to explore how individual characteristics, relationships, socialization agents, and contexts interact to influence social, emotional, mental, and physical health. She is particularly interested in understanding these processes among families of Asian heritage and Muslim religious backgrounds, considering their minoritized, immigrant, and marginalized intersecting statuses across different countries. Dr. Cheah is the president of the Society for Research on Adolescence. She is also a fellow of the American Psychological Association, the Association for Psychological Science, and the International Society for the Study of Behavioral Development. Welcome, Charissa.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Marpheen Chann is an award-winning author, writer, thinker, and advocate, as well as a speaker on intersectionality, inclusion, and belonging. As a gay first-generation Asian American, born in California to a Cambodian refugee family and later adopted by an evangelical white working-class family in Maine, Marpheen uses a mix of humor and storytelling to help people view topics such as racism, xenophobia, and homophobia through an intersectional lens. His memoir, Moon in Full, won the Bronze AAPI Award for LGBTQ nonfiction. He became the first Cambodian American elected official in Maine in 2021 when he was elected as an at-large charter commissioner for the city of Portland, Maine, where he lives. Marpheen currently works in the nonprofit and advocacy sector as an executive director and founder of Kamai, Maine, and a consultant. He holds bachelor's degrees in political science from the University of Southern Maine, a law degree from the University of Maine School of Law, and a certificate from the Harvard Kennedy School. Welcome, Marpheen.
Thank you for having me.
So let's get started. Marpheen, tell us, how did you get involved in work on AAPI justice?
It was quite a long journey. I didn't get started in AAPI justice until I really got started on immigrant rights. And that's because, I was adopted. I was in the foster care system first from age 9 to 12. I was adopted at age 14, but had been living with my adoptive white parents since age 12. And so that was a really religious household, evangelical, anti-LGBTQ. I was closeted growing up. And so when I went to college, I first came out and started exploring that part of my life. Once I felt sort of settled in sort of that facet of my identity, I kind of looked up and, you know, felt I was missing other pieces of who I was, and that was the cultural heritage that I had been born into. Buddhism, Cambodian Khmer culture. I didn't know, a lick of Khmer at that point. I lost it all. For me, there was a longing to connect all the pieces in my life, and so, after finding my godparents and my biological family on social media, back when social media was safer and cooler. I had the opportunity to fly out to see them and to meet them and spent a full month, actually my birthday month of June, up until July 4th with my family, biological family. And when I got back, there was about probably that was 2012. That was probably 2 years I spent just reflecting on what do I do now? Because I think I'm a hopeless romantic, and so when I watched some of those movies back in the day, I thought all I had to do was make the trip, meet my biological parents, everything's gonna get figured out. I'm gonna solve all my issues. And I came back and I actually had more questions than I had answers. And for me, I learned by doing. And so I jumped into immigrant rights advocacy and founded Kamai Maine in 2017 to the point where, my growth as a leader, made many, many mistakes, working in community, working with people, but always reflected, always learned, always tried to push past discomfort. And in 2025, Kamai Maine is 7 years old, and we've got a staff team of five, including me, that I continually have to fundraise for, and we're doing important work. And the Cambodian community, the Khmer community, we're probably a little bit more visible than other Southeast Asian communities in Maine, and we're seeing sort of as a rising star, I guess you can call it, in terms of ethnic community-based organizations, nonprofits in Maine, and we're leveraging that to push for the building of an Asian American community center in Maine, which will be the first one. And I think that effort, us leading that effort in partnership with the Filipino community and the Chinese American community, goes to show you how, when people are confident and courageous in who they are and they embrace their cultural identity, their sexual orientation, what have you, you know, it really reverberates and ripples out to kind of create local change. I think justice really is grounded in people recognizing their inherent dignity and their inherent worth in the world. And once they do, they realize that other folks maybe don't have quite the same knowledge or the same relationship with themselves because of the systems that are in place, that have been built and strengthened and reinforced time and time again, and the forces that try to tear us apart. So I think justice really starts at the human individual level and then is amplified when it becomes sort of a community level initiative.
Wow, so much to congratulate you on and be thankful for. Thank you for sharing your personal story with us. Congrats on Kamai Maine's 7-year anniversary and on the development of your community center. I'm going to be watching out for that. And I'll ask Charissa, tell me about what you study and its relationship to Asian American and Pacific Islander justice, or AAPI justice.
Sure. Broadly, my work focuses on promoting well-being among AAPI youth, immigrant youth, and their families. And so we're really interested in understanding how young people's own characteristics, their thoughts, beliefs, and the relationships in their lives and the context can all come together to contribute to their positive development and mental health. So, for example, one project that we have involves Chinese and Korean immigrant families with young children aged 3 to 5 years of age, and we follow them over time. And we're really interested in how various community and social resources available to these families, how all this impacts the parents' adaptation, well-being, how they acculturate, and how all this also work together to impact their parenting, and then their children's social and emotional development, physical health, and academic competence, and really their transition and well-being in the US. And so by following them over time, we're able to understand what things stay the same, what aspects change, and identify risk and protective factors in the lives of these families. We also have a project with older children, so with adolescents, that may be more related to what we're going to be talking about here today, where similarly, we're interested in different aspects. So the youth's characteristics, their relationships, the context all work together. And so, for example, we're interested in the impact of racism and racial discrimination and how these affect young people's sense of identity, who they are, their sense of belongingness, their mental health, and how families and communities can help them respond with strength, pride, and purpose. We're really interested not just how parents and communities can help teenagers, but also how teenagers can also teach parents, and their communities can be actively engaged, and how they both help each other to learn about these issues. And so these, what we call bi-directional processes, from youth to adults and from adults to youth, these are important to examine in order to really get a more complex picture of how their sense of racial injustice, how their racial ethnic identity motivates them to get involved in their communities. And so in this project, we also look at what are positive aspects and what are strengths and what are really challenging sides of these various relationships and aspects in the context. So racism being a challenging aspect, for instance, and what promotes resilience in these families. Another thing we're really interested in young people is how they develop a sense of critical consciousness. So that's the ability to recognize and to question and to understand social inequities as systemic issues and not just individual issues. And the research shows that critical consciousness helps support young people in becoming more active agents of change in their communities. And so to study all of these, I use what's called mixed method, which means a mixture of different approaches. So we administer surveys, we do interviews, we do observations of how parents and adolescents, for instance, have discussions, or parents and children interact with each other. And as I mentioned, we do longitudinal studies, which means we follow these families over time. You know, my work really combines a mix of developmental psychology, of social psychology, cultural psychology, Asian American studies, also to understand the bigger and broader context of the US, for instance. And we also incorporate community-based and youth participatory approaches. So putting youth's voices and the communities at the center, really with the end goal of uplifting their voices and to try to support racial and civic justice from the family and from the youth's perspective.
Yeah, I was going to ask you what AAPI justice means to you, but I heard you talk about strength, pride, and purpose as it relates to identity and culture. And that sounds like, you know, a good starting point and hand in hand with Marpheen's discussion of inherent dignity.
Yeah, exactly. Believing in the inherent strengths and inherent worth that these youth and families have and their cultures bring to their lives, and really that they have the capacity and they have the right to have the supports and opportunities to thrive.
And I think, you know, Marpheen's description of his journey to his current identity is one of critical consciousness, right? And that was a beautiful illustration for us. Let me ask now, Marpheen, where you are with Kamai, Maine, what does a day in the life look like for you? I've heard a little bit about your past. Tell us about your present.
A day in my life is very complicated. um, and I have to remind myself I'm a 34-year-old executive director. And in addition to the nonprofit I run, I have the author space, and then I have the political space. But the nonprofit and political, even though they're supposed to be separate from a C3 status, it's sort of like we're a cultural organization. We do some advocacy. And so there ways the world crosses and intersects. But I think, a lot of it is sort of coordinating from a 30,000-foot view, being able to see the landscape and what might be on the horizon, and being able to translate that down to sort of my staff who are on the ground implementing programs that infuse a lot of what Charissa mentioned. And so it's day to day changes, shifts, sometimes very fast, which I don't like because I'm a very slow burn kind of person. I like to think and strategize, but in especially in these times when things are moving so fast in the policy world, I wouldn't call it policy because it's being done in the shadows, and it's sort of counter to the rule of law. So it's more nefarious things that are happening. We're sort of forced to pivot. We're forced to change our approach. But for me, I rarely find time to sit in front of the computer and do work that I wish I could do because I get pulled away. Oftentimes I'll be on in the car driving to one other meeting, but also taking a phone call at the same time. I try not to text, just in case anyone is listening. And so, very much multitasking, doing multiple sort of projects at once. In terms of the day of a life, just in generally, in terms of Kamai Main, most of our programs happen on the weekends because our community works during the week. They work second and third shifts. And so a lot of them are sleeping between 4 or 5 a.m. to 12 p.m., 1 p.m. And then they're off to work 2 p.m., 3 p.m., and then up until 11 p.m. or 1 p.m. And a nonprofit, we work 8 to 4:30, right? And so it's hard to do our work during the week. So a lot of our work shifts to the weekend where we have our elder classes, we have our dance classes for Combined Youth on Saturdays and Sundays. And so for me and my staff, we're always not complaining, but sort of saying like, well, we don't have a standard work week like, someone who has a 9 to 5 office job. We're pretty much working every single day. We're on every single day, at least for a few hours. And for me, there's a dissonance and a sort of paradox, I guess, where I've gotten better at it. But in my 20s, I would go to bed at like 12, 1 a.m., wake up at 4 or 5 a.m., 6 a.m., and then do work. I've gotten better. I go to bed at 11 p.m. most times now. It's weird. My day right now is a lot of mentoring and a lot of strategic guidance for my staff. And with any staff team, three are great, but there's one who struggles with work-life balance. They're answering emails at 11 o'clock at night, or they're showing up to staff meeting 15 minutes late, and their eyes and their face is really puffy because of lack of sleep. And so I feel like it sounds small, but in the grand scheme of things, but I feel like my day is spent making sure that we have a culture of care in our work, because if they don't take care of themselves, they cannot take care of our community members. So that's a lot of what I do from day to day is keeping track of workloads, knowing that there's too much work out there because even though we're a staff team of 5, our community is struggling with a lot of needs and a lot of you know needs that stem from trauma, stem from community breakdowns, stem from family issues, intergenerational trauma. That's what my day looks like for the time being. Maybe someday I can say that I focus maybe 20% on staff oversight and more fundraising, but currently it's just making sure we instill a culture of care.
No, that's so useful, I think. I just wonder to what extent Charissa relates to that. I heard you talk about mentoring. I'm guessing she does some of that, project management. Charissa, what does your day look like? And does this sound familiar?
A lot of this sounds very familiar, and but I don't think I get to complain anymore after listening to Murphy talk about his typical day. You're absolutely right, Asia. Like I heard a lot of, processes there that were very familiar. Similarly, I mean, I don't feel that any one day looks alike. A typical day, perhaps it makes more sense to sort of break it up into the different areas. So in general, some research, teaching, mentoring, service, and that includes like lots of meetings, serving on committees, and then various aspects of engaging with the community. And then, of course, somewhere in there, finding time to write. As I think, yeah, we can all, here in this room relate to that. I tried to think of an example day. So I might begin the morning meeting with my lab team, which comprises of graduate students and undergraduate students. So we might be discussing a finding that the students are working on, or something from that was interesting that was revealed by the data. And so we're discussing it to try to make sense of it, looking at some of the data, looking at videotapes or survey responses. We might talk about the statistical analyses that the students are struggling with. And, we try to help each other with that. And then there's the formal teaching, which involves, being in the classroom, standing in front of graduate students or undergraduate students at the university. And in the classroom, I still try to bring in and get students to really think critically about how systems and culture and context can shape development. So I teach courses on child adolescent development, on parenting, on culture and context. And, I get them to think also and question how research can be used to advance equity. And I often bring in examples from our various projects or studies to make different theories and methodologies that we're learning about on paper come alive. And similarly, I really encourage students to connect their own experiences to these larger questions that we're dealing with in the classroom. And so I see mentorship as related, but really different, more in line with what Marpheen was talking about as well. And that mentoring is one of the most meaningful parts of, my role that I just love it. As I mentioned, I have undergraduates and graduate students and I mentor them. I also mentor early career scholars in the field, many of whom are AAPI or children of immigrants. And so, either they're working on these topics or they are, members of the community. And together, we don't just talk about the research, we don't just talk about the data and design, but we really talk also about life and navigating academia, not having role models, not, experiencing microaggression, and how do we deal with that? How do we, manage all of this, bring ourselves and our true selves to the work that we do, rather than try to hide them like these aspects of ourselves, like I used to do when I was a graduate student and didn't have role models, or when these various aspects of identity weren't something that we talked about as much. So, really finding ourselves and balancing the self with the work that we do. And then, lots and lots of meetings, be that serving on committees, as I said, in the department, university, or the community level, advisory board meetings. But also, we try to go out and meet with community partners to really stay connected. A lot of times in the evenings, we have our youth advisory board meetings. We try to work on creating different workshops in order to share the different findings that we have to the broader community. And, once in a while, I get to go on the Hill, get to talk to my, lawmakers and their staff to, again, share the various findings, research findings that we have about child development more broadly, to hopefully help them make some policy decisions that are informed by the science. And so really no 2 days are alike, but each one, I think, if I had to give an overriding theme, connects science, connects teaching, mentorship, service, writing, and life is very chaotic. But in that way, it's also always, very interesting. And like Marpheen, a lot of this work gets done at night on the weekends, right? Because the days are taken up by a lot of these in-person meetings. And so then the actual, work gets done at those hours, when most things are closed and we have more peace and quiet to be able to get to the material.
Despite as busy as, you've described your days and weeks as being, I hear you also articulating the importance of creating a culture of care. You were talking about in mentoring, it's not just about statistics, it's about dealing with microaggressions. It's about dealing with the fact that you don't have role models who share your racial or ethnic background. It's about, being authentic in a white supremacist environment. I hear you both taking a lot of time and energy to do that work with your team members, as well as the work that you do in communities. And I just want to express some appreciation for that. Charissa spends her days doing research, teaching, mentoring. Marpheen, what would you want from academics doing this work? What questions do you need answered by the research? What kind of solidarity would you like to build with academics, or what would you like to see them doing to support your work?
Want them to do a lot. I mean, the progress has been made, right? After the Atlanta shootings and Stop Asian Hate took off, there has been a big movement towards data disaggregation and recognizing the disparities within just the Asian American community, which is not a monolith and it is, not a model minority. And I think that it's starting to shift to the point where academics have been looking at it for a while off and on, but now there's just a groundswell of research into it. And I think that the research is there about trauma, intergenerational trauma, survivors, domestic violence, prevalence of substance misuse among refugee populations. But I think that that could still be studied, but it can be studied to death as well because our communities have newer generations. What they're wanting to see some more is sort of, okay, you've talked about our grandparents or our parents' generations, how they survived, but that doesn't necessarily speak to my experience in the schools. And there's been so one and a half generation Cambodians, for instance, they were born in the Thai refugee camps. They never stepped foot in Cambodia. Well, they might have traveled back since, but they mirror a lot of like experiences of second generation immigrant kids who don't quite achieve as much as their parents might in terms of savings and work and all that type of stuff. And then they get looped into the carceral system, incarceration. Third generation kind of makes it out, starts to make some progress. I think generally that seems to be the through line among different immigrant populations. And so I think the Cambodian population and Southeast Asian populations, they are interested in learning, okay, so where is my experience documented in the academic research? Growing up in a school where our food was made fun of, and then now we're adults and our food is celebrated, but at the same time our food is being stolen and profited off of. Trader Joe's has its own sriracha sauce now. And when kids ate sriracha sauce and growing up in the 90s and 2000s, they were made fun of. People opening up Asian style restaurants, but the owners aren't Asian. And so we're at a point where we're seeing like our culture reflected back to us, but we're also seeing the false mirrors as well, because it's trendy, because it's something new. K-pop is huge. I think there's an element of like celebration there, but then there's some questions about it. That's where academics can lean in, sort of, how does this affect the Asian community, especially given that the Asian community still struggles with representation in media, in different outlets, with the current backlash that's happening against quote unquote wokeness or DEI. You're probably going to see less people of Asian descent moving into higher level positions, and of course the violence that's been invoked against the Asian communities. So there's a lot that academics can do, but I think underlying all that is definitely sort of figuring out what's the best way to disaggregate the data. Also moving forward, how do we study that? Because the Cambodian population, I think, because it's been lumped into sort of the overall Asian American community group, my gut instinct that maybe could be studied is when they arrived as refugees, there's a lot of attention, a lot of resources flowing that way. But then the minute that sort of, I don't know, 10 years pass, everyone sort of, okay, they're all okay. We can move on to the next area of need or the next group. I don't think they understand how deeply harmful that is, it creates a vacuum and the communities all of a sudden figure out how do we fill in the gaps in terms of funding. There's always that lurking stereotype or stigma that Asians don't actually need resources from us because they're fine. They've got those businesses, they've got the restaurant, they've got that pharmacy job, or they're a doctor in their community or something. And so we have to work twice as hard for resources. So I think at the high level, that's what academics can help us with. And then at the sort of more community level, continuing to study health disparities, wealth gaps, and even going to the minute detail difference between where the refugees from largely urban areas of Cambodia that escaped before the worst of the genocide happened and where they were resettled or moved to in the United States versus 10 years later, the refugee population that is largely uneducated and rural moving here, largely living in the urban centers. So there's that line that is just exists here in Maine where the people living in a certain town in rural Maine were the ones who were families that had left before a huge amount of the fighting, had the resources to do so. And then a lot of the Cambodians living in the urban areas in Maine were the ones who were largely rural. They couldn't get an education past third grade, and they couldn't get out until the UN stepped in finally. So there's a lot of research that could be done. I mean, domestic violence, I can tell you, is probably still a lurking problem. It's hard for me to dig into it because I can't just go in and be like, "Are you experiencing harm?" without potentially ripping the whole community because so many people are related to each other, and I already get accused of, even though I had no part in it, of getting one of the monks fired just because they see my proximity to the temple because I help the temple out a lot in terms of governance and leadership. And so there's that piece, and then the community cohesion is always an interesting factor for me to look at because Cambodian society was kind of like ripped apart and people were turned on each other, including family members. How is what I'm seeing today in terms of rampant gossip, rampant drama between families, a lot of distrust, a lot of money related gambling issues? How is that also a symptom of the trauma? There's a lot.
Yeah, that was a diverse and urgent research agenda for the next several hundred years that you've
Yeah.
articulated for us. And we're going to
Yeah,
get
and
right
it's
on it. We're going to get
yeah,
right on it.
and it's definitely not unique to us. I mean, we probably have a lot to learn if we looked at the academic research on indigenous communities. Like one program we have is our outdoors program, which we're connecting people of all ages to the land, to outdoor opportunities in Maine to build a sense of belonging. But then our elder class, we're about to start a mental health kind of series of classes. And part of that is also working in some Wabanaki indigenous education. Our families were displaced, moved across the globe, but indigenous tribes, they have to live and endure in a small corner of the land that they used to occupy. And then the re-education schools, the sort of trauma that they went to is different, but also some of it, the long term sort of uh, cultural genocide, I think, is an interesting parallel to kind of see.
Carissa, I saw you
So
nodding your head vigorously. I saw you nodding your head. Is there something you want to pick up on there, from the cultural appropriation to the disaggregation of data? We're talking about health disparities. Uh,
Right. Yeah. So many things that really resonated with me. Some of the challenges that you speak about, Marfine, are also challenges that researchers are experiencing. For instance, coming from the model minority myth that, all Asians are doing well. And so the reason why there is, or at least, it's getting better, as you said, but why there was so much data that was disaggregated. I mean, we're lucky if there is even data on AAPI communities. A lot of data sets don't even include AAPIs to begin with. And then when they do, it's either a very small sample, so you can't disaggregate, or you can't even look at it as a group, and so you just leave it out of the analyses that you do. But because of the model minority myth perception, there's very little research funding to support this work. And I think that that's where it really starts, right? So if there's no funding, it's very difficult to do the research at all. And if there's a misperception that this work is not needed, because there are no disparities, we get a vicious cycle, right? There's no problem, so we don't need to put money into studying the problem. But if there are no studies about it that document that there are inequities, then again, we're not going to put funds where there are no issues. And so that really, the impact, like you talked about, the impact that has on the communities, and we can see that the need is there, the need is great, and this further attention is really necessary. And I think that the other thing that came to mind as you were speaking was also the need to really look at nuances in what we're studying, right? So it's beyond disaggregation, but what are, as you said, the specific issues that specific sub-communities are, even within the Cambodian community, for instance, are addressing, those from rural versus urban areas, those coming at different periods of times, at different ages, right? Like what age you immigrate, or come to this land also matters and impacts your trajectory and the resources that you have and how you develop. And the only way that we understand these nuances as researchers is really to work with folks like you and community groups like you to really understand what are the research questions that need answering, rather than assume that based on theory we have ideas about what what we need more data on. And so, that really, what you said really spoke to me, in that the necessity of truly meeting communities where they're at. The other thing that you talked about that spoke to me was also the difficulty of working with communities that have been historically harmed, right? Like, how do we earn their trust? How do we get in there? And as researchers, if folks like you, who are part of the community and working with the community, have challenges getting in there. And I'm from Malaysia, so also Southeast Asia, and understanding the tightness of these communities, and the difficulty, as you said, of even doing this work as a cultural insider, because they're worried that someone else in there and they're not willing to share. And so for researchers who have this reputation already rightly earned of coming in and just asking questions and then leaving these communities to fend with the whatever damages they've done, and now we're changing and trying to work with communities. Like, how do we do that? I don't have any answers, but I'm just thinking about all these
yeah,
various
Carissa,
challenges. Yeah.
I mean, just you mentioned assumptions, just to, like, to give two examples of that very quickly, because I know
Sure.
I'm a little bit of a long talker. But one assumption I made was that high schoolers, middle schoolers would actually know what the definition of what it meant to belong was. So we had a
Mm-hmm.
summer basketball program, and I had a survey that I did, one at the beginning, one in the middle, one at the end. And each time I asked, do you feel like you belong in your community? Do you feel like you belong at school? Do you feel like you belong in this program?
Mm-hmm.
And most of those kids, their scores ranged so much that I was like, maybe they actually don't know what that means. And so that was one thing that assumption that I had made that I needed to correct. The second one was to your point about how close-knit the community is. I remember DHHS once reached out to me to see if there was a Cambodian family that could take in Cambodian child that needed fostering. And I had to say no because everyone in the community knows that child and the parents know everyone in the community. So I think what you're trying to do is remove them from a situation, and you're trying to do the right thing of trying to do a culturally competent placement. But unfortunately, we're 2,500 community members, and so that didn't really work out. But there's two examples of what you had mentioned.
Yeah, those are great examples to really make concrete some of the challenges that we've been talking about.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. I really feel like this episode in particular could go on for 3, 4 hours easily. And I'm so sorry to have to wrap it up, but I do want to give you both the last word. Is there anything that you want listeners to take away? Anything that you didn't get to articulate today that you feel is important? Anything that you need them to know?
I would say, as a researcher, maybe being selfish, but speak to your lawmakers and policymakers and really advocate for everything, the need for funds to do the kind of work that both Marpheen and I have been talking about. I think that's really fundamentally very important. We've for too long relied on individual people and individual, kind of also like community groups doing this hard work with using our own funds and sacrificing, like our own resources to be able to make this work. It really needs to be something that's valued at a broader systemic community, state government level. And I would really implore, listeners who feel moved to just, to do that.
Yeah, I'll say that, for folks, if they want more information on what Khmer Main does, I do try to keep our social media and our website up to date. Khmer Main, spelled Khmer, KHMER, Main.org, Main spelled out. But we're figuring out a survey, a community wellness survey. So we're hoping to get some of those results out next summer. But Charissa, don't mind if I might send you a draft of those questions because we're kind of struggling with that right now.
Would love to. Yeah, would love that. Would love more also contact between the two of us. So grateful that Asia brought us together. Maybe a selfish plug if you want to find out more or reach out to me. My lab website, probably the easiest, is ccadlab.umbc.edu. And so, yeah, happy to hear from anyone.
Thank you for your time. Thank you for the ways you're creating a community of care. And thank you for all the effort that you put into the work you do.
Thank you for this opportunity, Asia.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. That was Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. To learn more about how we use brain and behavioral science to empower human rights defenders, find us at mindbridgecenter.org and follow us on social media.